They say the quickest way to learn what a person is made of is to hand them a little bit of power over someone who can't fight back. I've watched that test run 1,000 times over the years, in boardrooms and break rooms and church basements, and it never once lied to me. My name is Walter Grady. I'm 67 years old. I drive a 2006 Ford Explorer with 214,000 miles on it and a check engine light that's been on so long I've started to think of it as a dashboard decoration rather than a warning. The paint on the hood has gone the color of an old dollar bill, and the passenger door only opens if you lift the handle and lean into it with your shoulder at the same time, which I've gotten so used to doing that I forget other people find it strange. I wear the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation, washed soft, nothing torn but nothing new either. I live in the house I built the frame of with my own hands 33 years ago on Becob Hollow Road, out past where the county stops paving and the gravel takes over, where my nearest neighbor Earl Dunmore waves at me from his tractor most mornings and once told me, dead serious, that I dressed like a man who'd lost a bet. I told him I hadn't lost anything. He laughed. I laughed. We talked about his soybean yield for a while, and I drove home. Here's what Earl doesn't know. Here's what the fellows at the feed store don't know. What the young loan officer at the bank didn't know last spring when he slid a brochure for a starter tractor financing plan across the counter to me like he was doing me a favor. I own Ridgeline Capital, agricultural land, commercial real estate, a controlling interest in 2 regional trucking companies, spread out across 11 states through a structure built specifically so my name never has to show up anywhere anybody would think to look. No newspaper profile. No plaque with my name on a hospital wing. Nothing. I built it that way on purpose, one decision at a time, over 4 decades of getting up before the birds and never once mistaking attention for accomplishment. Ridgeline Capital is worth $2.8 billion. I drive a truck that smells like a dog that hasn't lived with me in 6 years, and I wouldn't trade it for anything with a bow on the hood. Now let me tell you about my daughter. Callie Grady Wexford is 32 years old, and if you asked me to describe her in one word, I'd tell you the word doesn't exist yet, so I'd have to invent one. She's sharper than her mother and kinder than me, and she's got a way of going quiet right before she says something that changes the whole conversation. When she was 8, she talked me into letting her keep a raccoon as a pet, using an argument so airtight I still bring it up at family dinners. I remember thinking, this one's going to run something someday. I was right about that. What I didn't see coming was who she'd end up married to. 4 years ago, Callie brought home Preston Wexford. I want to be fair to Preston. I try to be a fair man, so let me say this as generously as I can manage. Preston Wexford is what happens when a firm handshake decides it never wants to end. He's 36, tall, the kind of handsome that comes from spending real time in front of a mirror rehearsing it. He wears his watch like it's doing him a favor by being on his wrist. And inside of 20 minutes of meeting me for the first time, he'd worked in his law degree, his marathon time, and a trip to Aspen he'd taken just to clear his head. He said Aspen the way some men say words they've practiced saying. I nodded. I told him that sounded nice. 8 months after that first dinner, Preston Wexford was named Regional Director of Halbrook Freight Solutions. Now here's where I need you to lean in a little, because this is the part that matters. Halbrook Freight is one of Ridgeline Capital's holdings. 390 employees, solid contracts, a company I'd spent over a decade building into something real. Preston got that job through what looked, from every angle a person could see, like a clean and competitive process. Search firm, panel interviews, background checks, a board vote, looked immaculate. What Preston did not know, and still doesn't know as I'm telling you this, is that I sat quietly behind every single stage of that process. I reviewed the shortlist personally. I read his references myself. I signed off on the final offer. Then I went home, changed into my work boots, and spent the evening clearing brush along the fence line. Preston texted Callie that night, and she called to read it to me over the phone, practically glowing. Landed the director role. This is the one, Dad. I told her. I was proud of him. I meant it, too, back then. That mattered to me. Meaning it. I want to be honest about something. I gave Preston every chance a man can reasonably give another man. I've hired enough people in my life to know first impressions are just a rough draft. People surprise you sometimes. Preston didn't surprise me. He confirmed himself, slowly, the way people usually do if you're patient enough to watch. It started small, little comments here and there. Then came the company holiday party, his company, as far as he knew, where he introduced me to two of his colleagues, and one of them, a young woman from finance, asked what line of work I was in. Before I could answer, Preston jumped in with a laugh and said, "Oh, Walter's retired. Callie's dad. Great guy. Low maintenance." Then he steered them off toward the bar like I was a coat check he'd already handled. I smiled. I let it go. I filed it away, the way I file most things. But the moment that actually mattered happened on a Wednesday afternoon about 5 months ago. I'd stopped by Halbrook's regional office to go over some numbers quietly with one of my people, the way I do a couple times a year, unremarkable, an old man in a canvas jacket that nobody looks at twice. I was walking past the corner near the executive offices when I heard Preston's voice through a half-open door, talking to someone I didn't recognize. "Callie's dad," he was saying, and I could hear him grinning through it. Sweet old guy. Kind of a nobody, if I'm honest. Probably farmed his whole life or something. Drives this ancient explorer that smells like wet dog. Callie feels like she has to check in on him, which, it is what it is. Family's family. I straightened my jacket and walked back the way I'd come. Nobody. Wet dog. I let those two words sit with me for 5 months. Patience isn't hard for me. My father used to say a river doesn't argue with a rock. It just keeps flowing, and one day the rock's gone and the river's still there. I kept flowing. If this story's holding your attention, do me a favor and hit subscribe. Costs you nothing, means a lot to us over here. Thank you, truly. The invitation came on a Sunday evening. Callie called me sounding lighter than she had in weeks. Preston's parents, Harold and Diane Wexford, wanted to host a family dinner at their place out in Ashford Ridge. Get everybody together, one big happy family. The whole idea of it. Harold had made his money in commercial insurance. Diane's entire personality, as far as I could tell, was constructed around the square footage of her sunroom. "You'll like them, Dad," Callie said. "They're just very put-together people." "I'm sure they are, sweetheart," I said. I already knew a few things about Harold and Diane Wexford that would have made that sentence a lot harder for Callie to say, but I kept quiet. I told her I'd be there. I told her I was looking forward to it. Then Preston called me directly, which was unusual enough on its own to be interesting. Friendly, casual. The voice of a man about to say something he already knows is a little insulting, but has decided to say anyway. "Hey, so, quick heads up about Saturday," he said. "Mom and Dad, they're kind of old school about appearances. So maybe think about, I don't know, dressing up a touch? Nothing crazy. Just something, a step above the flannel, you know?" There was a pause. "Preston," I said, "easy as anything. I appreciate you thinking of me." Of course, he said, relieved. "Just want everybody comfortable." "I understand completely," I said. "I'll see you Saturday." I hung up. I stood in front of the mirror in the hallway for a good long minute. Then, I went to the closet, moved past the good suits in the back, the ones I wore when Ridgeline closed on the trucking acquisition 9 years ago, moved past all of it, and pulled out my plainest clothes, clean, pressed, unremarkable. I laid them out for Saturday. Then I walked out to the Explorer, patted the hood twice, the way you pat a good dog before you ask it to do something important. "We're going to a dinner, old girl," I thought. "Dress code's humble. We've got that covered better than anybody." Because here's what Preston didn't understand. Here's what Harold and Diane didn't understand. I wasn't dressing down because that was all I had. I was dressing down because I wanted to see, clean and unfiltered, exactly who these people were when they thought there was nothing on the table worth performing for. And something told me, real quiet and real certain, 40 years in the making, that they were about to show me everything I needed to know. Saturday came in soft, the way big days always seem to. No fanfare, no warning. I woke at 5:30, same as I have for 40 years, made coffee black, the way my father drank it. Sat at the kitchen table looking out over the fence line while the morning came up gray behind the tree line. I was calm. I'm always calm. It's the most underrated weapon a man's got. I dressed slow and deliberate. Clean work slacks. A plain button-up, pressed the night before. My good boots. worn but polished. No watch worth mentioning. I looked at myself in the mirror and thought, yes, that's exactly it. The Explorer sat in the driveway, groaning its usual morning complaint before settling into an idle. Let's go meet these people, I thought, and I drove out to Ashford Ridge. The Wexford place sat behind a long private drive lined in hedges trimmed with the kind of aggressive precision that's trying to tell you something before you even get to the front door. We control things here, it said. Even the hedges. A young man stood near the entrance, not quite a valet, whose whole job seemed to be sorting arriving guests into welcomed or assessed depending on what pulled up. He looked at the Explorer, then at me, then back at the Explorer, doing the math a lot of young men have done in front of me over the years. Evening, sir, he said, recovering fast. I can park that for you. Much obliged, son, I said, handing him the keys. She pulls right a little. Don't let it worry you. I straightened my shirt and walked to the door. Harold Wexford opened it before I could knock, tall, silver-haired, the kind of man who'd probably filled up rooms without trying his whole life. His smile was warm in the way a smile is warm when it's been assembled rather than felt. Walter, he said, shaking my hand exactly as long as necessary and not a second more. So glad you made it. Come in, come in. The house said the same thing the hedges had. High ceilings, art chosen to impress rather than love, a staircase that curved up like it knew it was being watched. Diane appeared from the sitting room, elegant and precise, jewelry understated in the particular way that very expensive jewelry manages to be understated. Walter, she said, taking both my hands in hers, we've heard so much. You're just as sweet as Callie described. Sweet. There it was. Not sharp, not accomplished, not interesting. Sweet. The word people reach for when they've already decided you're not worth a second look. Thank you, Diane, I said warmly. Lovely home you have. She beamed. People who've built their whole identity out of what they own never get tired of hearing it admired. Callie crossed the room and wrapped her arms around me the way she has since she was small enough to fit under my chin. You look great, Dad, she whispered. So do you, sweetheart, I said. Preston appeared behind her, looked at my outfit, and I caught the flicker before he covered it, the half-second where his face said I specifically asked, followed by the recovery smile. Walter, glad you made it, he said, clapping my shoulder like he was performing warmth for an audience. Dad's got something special open. Something special. That turned out to be the whole theme of the evening, the wine, the china, the house, the family, everything special except me. We sat down to a table set, with the kind of deliberate formality that's built to remind certain guests exactly how far the gap runs. Crystal, heavy silver, candles that had likely never been lit before and likely wouldn't be again. I unfolded my napkin, looked around at these people who'd invited me into their home, and made myself invisible. Not because they did it to me, because I let them. Harold led the conversation the way men like Harold always do, from the front, loud, sure of himself, in a way that's never once been questioned. He talked markets, a recent trip to the Cayman Islands, Preston's instincts at Halbrook. That boy's transformed that whole division, Harold said, swirling his glass. Leadership's in the blood, I think. He glanced my way just briefly enough to make the contrast without saying it out loud. I nodded appreciatively. You must be very proud, I said. Then Diane turned to Callie with a smile that had a very specific shape to it. And Callie, you must feel so secure, having a husband who provides so well. Not every girl's so lucky. The table went quiet for half a second. Callie smiled graciously, but I saw her eyes. I saw them clear as anything. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip and said nothing at all, because the folder hadn't come out yet, and I knew, with the kind of certainty that only comes from waiting a long time for something, that once it did, this whole table was going to change shape. There's a moment in every long game where patience stops being a virtue and turns into a verdict. That moment showed up right around dessert. I'd been sitting at that table 2 hours, nodding, smiling, complimenting wine I didn't care about, laughing at Harold's stories that weren't quite as funny as Harold believed. I'd played the part clean. The sweet old man, Callie's harmless dad, the fellow with the smelly truck who probably peaked early. I wore it comfortably all evening, and not one soul at that table suspected there was anything else underneath it. Then Harold reached under his chair, and I felt that quiet internal shift I've learned to recognize over the years, the one that tells you a situation just moved from waiting to happening. He set a leather folder on the table, smoothed it once with his palm, and slid it toward me. "Walter," he said, voice dropping into a rehearsed register. "There's something we'd like to talk through as a family." I looked at the folder. Didn't touch it yet. Diane's hands were folded neat on the table. Preston sat up straighter, trying to look casual about something he clearly wasn't casual about at all. Callie glanced at me, quick and uncertain, then back at her father-in-law. Her hands in her lap weren't still. "Preston's got a vision," Harold went on. "A real one. His own firm, built from scratch. The kind of opportunity that comes around once. We believe in him completely." "As you should," I said. "What we need is startup capital," Harold said, nodding toward the folder. "And what we're proposing is straightforward. Callie's trust, the one from her mother's side, used as collateral to secure the initial loan. Fully legal, properly drawn up. We just need your blessing, Walter, as her father." I picked up the folder, opened it, and read every page slow and careful while the candles burned down and nobody at that table said a word. I'd known, of course, exactly what they thought they knew, that Callie's late mother had come from a modest but real family inheritance, land mostly, enough to make a banker's eyes light up if you didn't look too close at what it actually was. Preston had clearly gone digging, found the deed records on a property nobody'd bothered updating in the county system, and built a whole fantasy on top of a number that hadn't existed in 11 years. I closed the folder, set it down gentle, picked up my water, and looked at Harold with the warmest smile I own. "I appreciate the thought that went into this," I said. "I'll review it carefully." Harold exhaled like a man setting down a weight. Preston's shoulders dropped half an inch. Diane reached for her wine, relieved. They thought they'd won. I made pleasant conversation another 20 minutes, thanked Diane for a wonderful evening, shook Harold's hand firm, held his eyes 1 second longer than he expected. He had no idea what that second meant. I said nothing for 16 days. Not a word, not a ripple. Mended fence line. Had coffee with Earl on his porch. Drove the Explorer to church and back. On day 5, Preston texted, "Hey Walter, any movement on the proposal?" Exciting stuff. I waited 3 hours and typed back, "Still reviewing, son. These things take time." He sent a thumbs up. I set the phone down and made one call. Not to Preston. Not to Harold. To 3 senior people on Halbrook's regional board, men who'd known me a long time and understood that when I called personally, it wasn't a social visit. "Run a full compliance review," I said. "Standard scope. Start today." Then I hung up and went back to the fence line. Because here's what Preston didn't know. What Harold and Diane, sitting out in Ashford Ridge celebrating over good wine, didn't know either. I'd written Preston's employment contract myself. Every line, including a non-compete and conflict of interest clause buried on page 11 that he'd signed 4 years ago without reading close enough. A clause I'd been writing into contracts for over a decade before Preston Wexford ever walked into my life, built specifically for men who think they're smarter than the room they're standing in. The review took 12 days to fully document, and when it landed on my desk, I sat with it a long while. Not because it surprised me, because I wanted to be sure, completely sure, before doing what came next. Preston had been quietly building a competing freight brokerage for the better part of 7 months, using Halbrook's client lists, Halbrook's carrier contacts, Halbrook's office hours, believing the whole time that nobody above him was paying attention. He'd forgotten something I consider fairly basic. You can't build a secret inside a house that belongs to the man you're hiding it from. Every meeting, every contact, every hour spent on it, documented, sitting in a folder on my desk on a Thursday morning when I put on the good charcoal suit from the back of my closet and drove the Explorer to Halbrook's regional office. I parked in the reserved space marked Ridgeline Capital, the one Preston had driven past 3 days a week for 4 years without once asking whose name was on it. I walked into the conference room and sat at the head of the table, board members to my left, legal to my right, the review findings in front of me, and waited on Preston Wexford, who believed he was walking in for a routine check-in. The door opened. He walked in wearing his usual confidence, scanned the room, took in the board members, the lawyers, the folder, and then found me sitting at the head of his table in a suit he'd never seen. I watched the understanding move across his face floor by floor. The search process, the contract, the review, his father's proud smile, the folder sliding across the dinner table. Every piece of the last 4 years arriving at once. The silence ran a full 10 seconds. I let every one of them land. "Sit down, Preston," I said. He sat. "I'm going to say this once," I told him, "not out of anger. I want you to hear that clearly. Anger's for men who didn't see something coming. I saw this coming the moment you told me to dress up for your parents' dinner table." I opened the folder. "Halbrook Freight is owned by Ridgeline Capital. Ridgeline Capital is owned by me. Has been for 17 years. The role you hold, the salary you've built your whole identity on, exists because I put it there. And for 7 months, you used what I gave you to build something meant to compete against the very thing that made you." I closed the folder. "The clause in your contract covers everything this review found. Legal's prepared to take this all the way if that's what it comes to." Every ounce of the confidence he'd walked in with was gone. He looked, for the first time since I'd known him, young, small, a long way from Aspen. "However," I said, "I'm not interested in ruining you. I'm interested in clarity. So here's what happens. You resign today, quiet and professional. Your name stays clean, and this stays in this room. Or we go the other direction, and everything in this folder becomes public record." He looked at the board, at the lawyers, then back at me, and I saw something I hadn't expected. Not defiance, not a performance. Shame. Real, quiet shame. The kind that only shows up when a man finally sees himself clean and doesn't care for what he finds. "I'll resign," he said, and the words looked like they cost him something on the way out. "Good," I said. I stood, buttoned my jacket, picked up the folder. At the door, I turned back. "One more thing. That trust your father proposed using as collateral. There's nothing sitting in that account, and hasn't been for 11 years. Your father did his homework on an old deed and skipped the part where the land sold off before Callie was even born. Tell your parents I said thank you for dinner. The lamb was very good." I drove home in the Explorer. Engine cleared its throat at the first turn of the key, same as always. Pulled into the driveway on Cobb Hollow, and just sat there a minute. 33 years of being the man nobody looked at twice, knowing exactly who I was the whole time. I patted the dash once. Good girl, I thought. Then I went inside and called my daughter. She showed up 20 minutes later, found me at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee already poured. She sat across from me and studied my face a long moment, reading it the way she's read it since she was small. I told her all of it, from the beginning, the company, the search process, the contract clause written a decade before Preston ever showed up, the review, the boardroom, the truth about her mother's land. When I finished, Callie sat quiet a long while. Then she looked up and asked the only question I'd been carrying the answer to for years. "Dad, why didn't you ever just tell me?" I looked down at my coffee, out at the dark fence line, back at my daughter, at her mother's eyes sitting right there in her face, at the girl who talked me into keeping a raccoon and won. "Because I wanted you to build your own life," I said, "not one people handed you because of what I own. I never wanted you looking at me and seeing a company. I wanted you to see your father." She cried. I held her hand across the table and let her. I thought about Harold sitting very still out in Ashford Ridge, Diane setting down her wine, Preston trying to find the words to explain to his parents why the quiet old man in the plain clothes turned out to be the one person at that table they should never, not for 1 second, have underestimated. I thought about all of it, and then I let it go, because the only thing that mattered to me was sitting right across the table, hands wrapped around a warm cup, eyes red, smiling through it anyway. My daughter, the finest thing I ever built. Some men don't look like much. They just are what they are, all the way through, and sooner or later, the ones who bet against that always find out the hard way. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button and subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one.